Hello and welcome to Voices of the Completed Life. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and I'm the executive producer of Completed Life Podcast. Today, in honor of Valentine's Day, a day to celebrate love, we will replay the audio version of a conversation my colleague, Sarah Kaskaden-Bechtel, had with the novelist Amy Bloom at our 2023 Fall Conference. We dedicate this episode to Brian Amici and all those we were lucky enough to know who loved life and loved us. What times are plain? It's the kind of mundane and innocuous question we ask our spouse or partner when we know there's an upcoming trip that won't involve us. Yet these 4 syllables profoundly embody the midlife romance between Amy Bloom and Brian Amici, as shared in her best-selling memoir, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. Amici was an architect who played football at Yale. He was tall and handsome. Bloom recalls he had a big laugh and was someone people liked being around. Bloom is a psychotherapist and writes novels with titles like Come to Me, Love Invents Us, and Lucky Us, revealing a penchant for romance and ruminations on the meaning and expression of love. Shortly after celebrating 10 years of marriage, Brian began to lose his sense of direction and would get lost on the way home from the grocery store. He needed to be reminded how to use the printer. His Italian taste buds started to fade, and he no longer stopped by the deli to pick up burrata or soppressata. After consulting a few neurologists at age of 66, Brian was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. It took less than a week for him to decide, as Bloom writes, the long goodbye of Alzheimer's was not for him. They understood this goodbye went in both directions, for the tragic nature of Alzheimer's meant that not only would he begin to fade away, but she as well would slowly, as she wrote, be expunged from his interior landscape. Already sensing the distance between them, Bloom observes, I imagine that Brian feels as alone as I do, but I can tell he isn't as afraid. Much of the book details their journey to Dignitas, a Swiss nonprofit organization that provides what is referred to in the United States as medical aid and dying. As Bloom explains, this is the only place to go if you're an American citizen who wants to die and you do not have a terminal prognosis with 6 months to live. In other words, knowing he would likely have at least a decade in front of him with significant decline, Amici asked Bloom to help him by honoring his wishes. She never discusses her position on Dignitas or medical aid in dying. As one reviewer noted, this is not a book explaining moral reasoning. Her title, In Love, is her explanation. They are pulling into the parking lot of Dignitas when Brian asks, what time is your flight? It was the most mundane question in the face of what was about to happen. And yet those 4 words said everything about their relationship that day. He didn't know what arrangements she made for what was next. They both knew she would be going forward alone, without him. And he loved her and cared about where she was going, every day, especially that day. That mundane and innocuous question echoed the vows they made to each other on their wedding day. As Bloom tells it, he squeezed her hand and said, "I love you so much. That's all I can say. I love you so, so much, and I will love you every day of my life." Then he whispers, "Your turn." Holding hands so tightly it felt as if they were holding each other up. Bloom said she could only remember part of what she had prepared to say that day. "You are the port in this storm. You are the storm. You are the sea. You are the rocks and the beach and the waves. You are the sunrise and the sunset and all of the light in between." Then she whispered, "Every day of my life." And he repeated, "Every day of my life." Whispers and promises of love, as she says in this interview, from another time and place. Every day of my life. In this season, on the day when we remember and honor those we love, I'm pleased to present Amy Bloom, interviewed by Sarah Kiskaden-Bechtel, Director of Public Policy and Programming at the Completed Life Initiative.
Good afternoon, Amy, and thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here.
Jane Hirschfield, the American poet, as you referenced in a class you taught, once said, "When you are beginning to write, open the window a little bit more than is comfortable, a few inches more." Could your book, In Love, be an example of where you opened the window a little bit more?
I think it is an example of that. It's funny. I have a poem by Jane on my bulletin board over my desk, which is a beautiful poem about love called "Each Moment a White Bull Steps Shining into the World." And it is, in an important way, the poem is a restatement that grief is the price you pay for love. And I think you are right about opening the window. I think she, who was always right, I think Jane is always right. And it is about opening the window a little bit more than is comfortable so that you can get a little more light, you know, and even a different current. And it's not always easy or comfortable, but I think if you can stand it, then it is helpful to you.
Beautiful. If I may, you wrote in an essay about writing about your second marriage from a different perspective, namely the perspective of your children and what they had expressed to you about your marriage. And I was fascinated by how much value writing from a different perspective gave you. In what ways did you write and perceive the book In Love from different points of view?
Well, in some sense, it was quite a different experience than writing a novel. You know, I don't really consider myself a memoirist. If I'm lucky, I'll never write another memoir again. But this, I tried to see it from the points of view, from the feeling standpoint of Brian, of his mother, of his therapist. But part of the gift of writing a memoir is you can also stay with your own point of view. I didn't feel like I had to be fair. I felt like I had to do my best to tell the truth. And some of the ways of conveying Brian's point of view was just writing down what he said so that the reader could hear him themselves. They could assess his behavior and his things that he had to say themselves. And so I feel like I was very lucky because my training as a clinical social worker a million years ago included something called process recording, in which we had to write, not just record, but write the beginning of the session all the way to the end of the session with all the transitions and all the topics covered from memory. And that was helpful because I got to write down a lot of important dialogue that went on between me and Brian, or me and Brian's mother, or Brian and his mother that I eavesdropped on.
So there were no recordings per se
No,
between you and Brian, or Brian of himself.
no.
And did the white bull that you mentioned earlier, did that become kind of a maybe an implied symbol throughout the book of something as a character that within the reality between you and Brian throughout the journey?
It is actually a poem that I turned to a lot. The end of the poem, there's a line about basically about the bull dying, and it says that you came to love it. That was the gift. Let the jealous gods take back what they can. And that certainly is actually, that's funny. That's a paraphrase on my part. What Jane actually wrote is the envious gods. I always think of it as the jealous gods, but it's the envious gods taking back what they can. And there were a lot of occasions where I needed to remind myself how lucky we had been, how lucky I had been.
Bringing the reader into your story, it it feels like such an intimate window into a couple very much in love, and that feels like such a privilege to be a part of, truly. Um, and the way that you weave time and space together is really captivating. At what point did you decide to structure your book the way that you did, where it takes the reader out of sequence almost, in and out of time?
Well, I wrote it more or less chronologically because that's how I sort of needed to get through my notes and the material. Anybody who's taking care of somebody with a serious illness knows you've always got the lists, you've always got the notebook, you've always got the scraps of paper. It says 3 o'clock this, 5 o'clock this, 4 o'clock that. So I had lots of notes, and I wrote the first draft just chronologically. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. When I went back again to look at it further, I really felt like what I wanted to be the present tense of the book was Zurich, was our time in Switzerland. That was going to be sort of the present tense. And then there was like the immediate past, everything that led up to going to the airport for the preceding, 6 months, 8 months. And then there was the more distant past, which was, our life together before he was symptomatic. And then I just thought I would braid them and I would keep the chapters short because they're painful. There's only so long you can stay with it. Everybody needs a break. And that's sort of how the structure came to be.
So let's turn to Brian and your relationship with Brian. On the very last page of your book, In Love, you describe your wedding
Mhm.
and your vows, and you said this quote, "You are the port in the storm, and you are the storm, and you are the sea, you are the rocks and the beach and the waves. You are the sunrise and the sunset and all of the light in between." I think I have more to say, but I can't. We are holding hands, pressed against each other, holding each other up. I whisper to him every day of my life, and he whispers to me every day of my life. Is that love? Does it whisper beyond place and time? Is love the light between us?
That's how it is for me. Everybody is different. Everybody comes from a different family. Everybody has different kinds of needs. But I am not a big holder backer, or whatever the phrase is. If I'm in, I'm in. And so I have found that I can't say that there aren't disappointments, and I can't say that you don't make mistakes and, break something here and there, but that is very much my nature, and it has worked for me. Um I don't I don't feel good sort of keeping a big part of myself back in judgment or in protection. It's like if I have to protect myself from you, I don't want to be with you. You know, I, you know, as they say, I can do bad all by myself. I don't have to take somebody else on.
In ethics, there's this idea of beneficence, the notion that carrying out the wishes of your loved one, and in the way that you did for Brian, as ultimately being beneficial to him by being supportive of his personal autonomy. Is that also what love is? Granting someone that autonomy?
I think so. I mean, I think, I also practiced as a psychotherapist for a long, long time, and I treat a lot of couples. And one of the things I say is that you have the right to leave, you have the right to choose to stay, but you do not have the right to berate somebody for 20 years because they are not who you want them to be. If they're not who you want them to be, you should probably not be with them. And I understand people have children and people have houses and it's very complicated. But most of us are pretty much formed as human beings. It doesn't mean that we can't change our behaviors if we're really determined to change our behaviors, and that we can't take a slightly different perspective, something like that. But we're baked. I mean, you're pretty much the person you're going to be by the time you're 10 years old. And I'm being a good sport about 10 because I actually think it's probably a little sooner. But um, saying to somebody, be different, is like saying, be taller. They're not going to be taller. You can criticize them every single day for 20 years and talk about how much you wish they were taller. They will not be taller. They can wear higher heels. They can stand up straight. They can carry themselves nicely, but they cannot be taller. And you either, to me, if you love them, you accept that. And they accept that in you. I think recognizing that everybody comes with their nonsense and their difficulties and their fallibilities is a smart way to start. It doesn't mean you can't embrace everything that's great about them, but you shouldn't be astonished every single time somebody who is a slob leaves their crap on the floor. And if it is enraging to you, that's probably something that you should address.
Indeed. It's woven into their DNA in many ways.
As is all of our nonsense woven into our DNA. And we have lots of things to thank our parents for and lots of things that we could have done without.
Mm.
But there they are, baked in, right with the bones.
So, where did Brian's self-determination come from?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is nature. His dad was a real hard driving football player. He was a hard driving football player. And also nurture, which is that his was a family in which if you didn't stand up for yourself, you would probably roll over. And he rolled over. And so he did stand up for himself. And I think that pushed him more in the direction even than his DNA, to be a fairly aggressive person. I said to the therapist who was so helpful to me when, after Brian's symptoms became really difficult to manage, I said, my husband has 3 guiding principles in life. The first one is, if there's going to be a fight, throw the first punch, which I think is very much how he approached this entire process. The second was, because he was raised Catholic, better to ask permission than forgiveness. I mean, no, better to ask forgiveness than permission. Tell them about it afterwards, and always take yes for an answer.
Throughout the book, he seemed to want to push to the finish line, certainly. And throwing the first punch is incredibly bold, especially given the circumstances of his diagnosis. And I was also really struck by, you described Brian as an architect, and I was delighted to see that he had designed women's athletic fields at Yale, a Girl Scout camp, even a leading assisted living facility. Is it fair to say that he wanted to design not only buildings, but his own death?
Absolutely. He was fussy and he was particular, and he liked certain kinds of design elements that he would always return to. And I think there were 2 things that Brian understood and was willing to understand, which I think is very hard for a lot of us, which was, this is terminal. There is no treatment. This will not be turning around. And as he said to me, it's pretty clear that if I don't leave early, I will not get to leave at all, which is, for people with dementia, 100% true.
And in what ways were you co-designing with Brian?
I don't know that I co-designed very much. I think I say somewhere in the book, he was a certain kind of CEO, and I was definitely like a kind of junior executive vice president. And I had said to him early on, you don't have to do that. You don't have to plan your own death. I can keep you at home. I will take care of you. I know how to do this. We will make it so that you are home for as long as possible. And he said to me, you're not hearing me. I want people to miss me when I'm gone. I don't want them to be relieved that the person who is no longer me finally passes away. I don't want everybody grieving a shell. I want to live inside the people who have loved me. And I don't want this other thing, this long shadow, for anybody, including myself. And he was very clear about it. And so, we began to research it. That would be mostly me, because I am more the researcher. And we talked about a lot of different possibilities, and some at some length. And then when we finally came across Dignitas, I talked to him about it, and he was like, well, I'd rather be at home with the kids and you, but this will be fine. And then, sort of being Brian, he was like, go make that happen.
And I know that unfortunately the process of applying to Dignitas was a nightmare, difficult, challenging. How would you describe it? And can you walk us through that process?
It was challenging. I want to say, in fairness to Dignitas, the things that were genuinely challenging were not on them. It was really on the help that we were receiving in the United States. With Dignitas, anybody can go to their website, and you send them, I think, about $300, and you become a supporting member. And that is as far as the relationship goes. If at some point you need their services, there is an application process in which you describe your circumstances. They ask you for a short biography. You will have to send medical records, any doctor that you're seeing. But that's basically all. And there are a couple of interviews over the phone. And then they make their decision, what they call sort of a provisional green light, always holding out the possibility that if you come to Zurich and you have the interview and the doctor doing the interview feels that you do not have the discernment or the cognitive judgment to proceed, they just won't do it. Or you get there and you change your mind, which they invite you to do constantly. They must have said to Brian 20 times, "Are you sure this is what you want to do? Do you want to talk about this further? Would you like to reconsider? We would be very comfortable if you reconsider." I think they do everything they can. The real difficulties, it's a bother. Have to chase down somebody's birth certificate from Kenosha, Wisconsin, if you don't live in Kenosha, Wisconsin. But the real difficulty was that his neurologist put down the reason for his MRI, which was part of her assessing his dementia, was a major depressive episode. And I saw that and I asked her about it. And she said, "Oh, it's not important. I just had to put down something for why he needed the MRI. And, I know he sees a psychiatrist, so I just figured, depression." And I made the decision not to say to her right then, "This will make it impossible for us to go to Dignitas," because Dignitas is very clear that they are not in the business of assisting people who are severely clinically depressed in ending their lives. That's not what they're doing. But she just felt that I was bothering her because I don't know why she thought I was bothering her. She just thought I was bothering her. And I called her twice and asked her to change it. And she said, "It's not important." And I said, "Well, I think it is." And she said, "Well, if you feel that way, why don't you come in a few weeks and we can talk about it?" And that to me was sort of my Hail Mary pass. If we hadn't been able to make any other headway, I would have gone in and tried to persuade her. But the truth is, you don't always know how people are going to feel about that kind of decision. And it made us both a little worried about bringing in somebody who we already did not feel we were all on the same team to then provide information for us so that we could go to Dignitas. And in the end, we were able to work around that, which is that Brian had a consultation, an extensive interview with a psychiatrist who said, "This man is perfectly cognitively capable of making his decision."
You mentioned the word discernment, and I know that came up in your conversation with Judy Schwartz at End of Life Choices New York. And can you talk a little bit about that journey through discernment for Brian?
Well, I think it was not so much a journey to it as being able to hold on to it. What they are looking for at Dignitas, what Judy Schwartz was so helpful in advising me about was the capacity to make decisions and to understand the consequences and the implications of those decisions. You know, you have to be somebody who can talk about what you are doing. You have to be somebody who knows where you are. You have to be somebody who understands that this is a final process, that there is a limit to the point at which you can turn back. I mean, it's very close to the end, but there is a limit to the point at which you can turn back. And you have to be able to demonstrate that you understand that and accept it and are clear about the implications and the consequences of your choices. That's really what discernment means. And as we know, if you are too far along the path of dementia, that's simply not possible. It's not a question of what one's wish might be, but it is not, you reach a point where you can no longer articulate those wishes and possibly not even remember those wishes.
So is it fair to say that it felt like there was a timer on this process and that time was running short, even though Brian's illness might and inevitably would run long?
Well, yes, and it's also sort of mysterious because you know that there's a timer, but you actually have no idea what it's set for, and nobody can tell you. Everybody who spoke to us, the neurologist, the psychiatrist, were all very clear that he was not likely to have a 20-year cognitive decline, that he might have a 3 or 4-year cognitive decline, but that his body might go on breathing and swallowing for 10 years after that. And that was particularly what he didn't want. And I think if he were a different kind of person, he might have said, well, let's just wait and see. But we also knew from having seen Alzheimer's close up that wait and see doesn't get you very far. It just allows you not to act for a while longer and not to face the inevitable for a while longer. But it wasn't as if either one of us didn't know pretty much what it would be looking like.
And when you describe Brian as really owning one of those principles of throw the first punch, I
Mhm.
thought about when he wrote his autobiography for Dignitas,
Mhm.
even lists how his father won the Heisman Trophy.
Yes.
Made me burst out laughing.
And, and then I had to say, because I couldn't help myself, I didn't have to say, but I did say, honey, they're Swiss. I don't think they know what a Heisman is. You could see that he was quite disappointed.
That really brought his persona to life in such a poignant and beautiful way. So now, if it's all right, I'd like to talk a little bit further about Brian's diagnosis.
Mhm.
And you write about the process of deciphering Brian's Alzheimer's, and the drawn out process of applying to Dignitas and how that became a full-time job for you. And you've described also that every relationship has an interior landscape. Can you describe that landscape of living with someone with Alzheimer's?
Well, I'm sure it is different. Alzheimer's takes a lot of different paths. The things that are affected first are different from person to person. I would say that Brian could have successfully designed a house even in the last 6 months of his life, but he couldn't operate the printer in the office. He simply could not remember from day to day what he had done to get the printer to work the day before. And in terms of the interior landscape of the relationship, again, it's very different for everybody. But Brian was a man who was really working on being more empathetic, who was working on taking into account other people's points of view, and working hard on it, genuinely working hard on it, not just saying, "Oh, I'm a work in progress." And one of the things that happened though is that we would have some kind of conflict between us. This before he was diagnosed for a couple of years. And what I recognize is that unlike the old days before he was symptomatic, where he would have said, oh, yeah, I see. I was a knucklehead. I'm really sorry, darling. You know, but let me think about it some more. You know, to me, the kinds of apologies that one hopes for, open hearted, fully felt, and determined to do better. But if you don't remember the argument that you and your wife had 2 hours before, it's pretty hard to apologize for it because you don't actually remember the event. And so we were no longer in some ways, in the same reality. Because I remembered the argument and I was looking for those wonderful, moving apologies that brought us closer together where we could both be sorry and both work harder. But he couldn't do that anymore, not because he didn't love me, but because he couldn't remember the conversation.
Was there a loneliness in that absence of connection?
I think so. And I think that's one of the differences, at least in my observation, between caring for a parent with Alzheimer's, which is also very difficult and very challenging and demanding and heartbreaking, and a spouse. Because this is your partner. It's not your parent, which is very important and very special, but most of us don't think of our parent as our life partner. I think if your parent is your life partner, it's probably very similar. But this is my guy. This is the person I'm gonna make the grocery list with, or pick the movie with, or cuddle with. This is my person. This is right. As they used to say on Friends, this is my lobster. And he still felt the connection to me, certainly. But the things that made it so were beginning to sort of unravel for him. And I don't think he ever stopped feeling connected to me. But because there are so many memories that were beginning to fall apart, I would say, memories and shared experiences and shared conversations is a lot of what makes a couple a couple. And I don't think people write that much actually about the loneliness of a caregiver for a spouse under those circumstances because, they'll say things, but it's so gratifying when you see a flash of the old personality. Well, of course, it is gratifying when you see that flash of the old personality. But if 23 hours a day you are taking care of and loving and tending to somebody who feels warmth towards you, but no longer actually knows you as a person, there's a loss of not only companionship, but even of personhood. Your value is actually not you in particular. Your value is the care.
Did Brian recognize when he was able to turn back to you and recognize your love?
A couple of times, but then it became clear to me that there would be less of that. You know, there were times I think when he felt that things were not going right between us. He would say, "Oh, we're not on the same page." And a couple of times he would buy me something as a gift or sort of an apology or a gesture. But the gifts themselves were so out of character for him. They're out of character for me as the recipient, but they were also really out of character for him. And that just sort of somehow underlined the gap. I mean, he was on his own journey. And as much as I wanted to be there with him and for him, and I think I was able to in many ways, that was a one-person boat. That's not a two-person boat. And that's hard to respect that and tolerate that and be there to be supportive and not be overwhelmed with grief at your own loss, I think. You want to have some good friends when you're doing that.
How did you keep going through that? How did you prop yourself up and just full steam ahead of, the toss is your job. You took that on wholeheartedly. How did you make it through?
Well, as I say, full steam ahead is my nature, but I'm sure most people feel this way. I have really terrific children, who were just supportive from the first moment. Their job, as they understood it, was to support me and to support Brian. And they're all different. I have a girl and two girls and a boy. None of them, they're not girls and boys anymore. They're women and men. And they were just there. And I could tell them or not tell them, but their response always was just, "Tell me what you need, Mama." And that was a wonderful gift. I had a couple of close friends who were also right there. I will say what nobody needs under these circumstances is people telling you what they would do and how they would do it differently. That's not a help, and I think it's hard for all of us. We all want to contribute our wisdom. We all want to talk about our own experiences, but as it turns out, what people need is for you to be there with them where they are, not where you are.
And that presence sounds like it was so important to hold you and carry you.
Very much. I remember the last fishing trip that Brian took, which he had a wonderful time and caught like just masses of fish. And there are all these pictures of him with these enormous fish because he wanted to demonstrate to me that he wasn't exaggerating, that they really were enormous fish. Two of my best friends came from different parts of the country. One came to stay with me for 2 nights at the beginning of Brian's fishing trip, and then somebody else came to me to stay for another 2 nights during the latter part of Brian's fishing trip, and that was just great. Just plenty of time to cry and watch movies and eat takeout and be absorbed in myself and my feelings without having to do any of the other work for those few days, and that was a tremendous gift.
Returning to departures and preparing for Switzerland, I thought it was very sweet how Brian prepared an email for you to
Mhm.
send out to, beloveds, at just the right time. I think right before getting on the plane. And it seemed very important to him that there would be no chance of anyone interfering. Um, why was he so concerned about interference?
Well, in general, he was a man who didn't like to be interfered with, so there was that. But also, most of his family were practicing Catholics, and he had often differed with them. I mean, there was certainly a lot of love and a lot of mutual respect, but they were by and large far more religious, and he was not religious at all, and also more socially conservative than he was. And he and I were both aware of a friend whose best friend had been diagnosed very early with Alzheimer's, and the woman with Alzheimer's and her husband had made a plan that included going to Dignitas. And when she, the woman with Alzheimer's, mentioned that to her sister sat down with her and the husband and said, "If you do this, I will report you to the police. This is against my beliefs, and I will not let this happen." So we were both aware of that, and it does happen from time to time. And Brian did not feel that anybody had the right to shape his life if he was not harming somebody else, nor did he feel that they had the right to shape his death.
That reminds me of a beautiful quote that towards the end of the book you write about Brian's mother, Yvonne, and she seems like such a sweet firecracker also.
Agree.
And Brian's forthright certainty about crafting his own death is completely palpable throughout the book. Not once does he seem to falter or have a sense of doubt or uncertainty. And in recalling the film about their family, the film was called A Film in Grief, the Amici story, after Brian's brother, Paul, passed in 1981. And the quote that really stood out to me was where you write that Yvonne says she remembers Brian saying in his voiceover narration that death is something we don't talk about, but that there is no life without death. And Brian also described his mother as an expert in death.
He did. I found that disturbing, but both of them were very comfortable with it. They were like, "Oh, absolutely. This is our field. We know all about this."
Where did that certainty come from?
Well, I think for Yvonne, her parents died when she was in her teens. She was the oldest of 3 girls. Her younger siblings were twins. One of them died quite early in Yvonne's house. Yvonne basically turned her house into a hospice for her sister. Um, Paul died at 20. Her husband, Alan, died at 55. She remarried, lovely guy, Glenn Davis, who also died and left her a widow. I think she felt like she had been through a lot of grief and a lot of death, and she knew something about the terrain. And she had always been quite open in sharing that with her kids and with Brian, who was, the oldest and very much the oldest Italian son of a large Italian family.
And with Brian's certainty around death and Yvonne's, tragic exposure to so many deaths. How did you enter into relationship with their understanding of death?
Well, I was very grateful. I was enormously grateful to Yvonne. I mean, I just think she was really an extraordinary person, and still is. She's about to have her 90th birthday. I just spent a lot of time finding a really nice gift.
Wow.
And
Happy birthday, Yvonne.
I know, happy birthday, Yvonne. And I respected both of their points of view and didn't really differ with it. I mean, I would have done what Brian did. Might have come to it a little differently. I might have come to it a little later. Might have dragged my feet more. But that decision to want to value the quality of your life, even over the quantity, is something that I certainly respected and supported. And I was very grateful. What mattered to me the most was that Brian had his mother's support. I could have acted without his mother's support. She wasn't my mother. But it mattered to me that he was able to rely on that from her. And that was an extraordinary gift. And if she was the world's worst person, I would still love her and forgive her.
That's a profound thing to say, especially about your mother-in-law.
She was a class act. She did the right thing, and she did it big time and wholeheartedly.
I'm so happy for the three of you and your families that you had this richness together and that she could support you in probably the hardest decision.
And she said she was relieved. She said she had prayed about it all night. When she woke up, she realized that she was relieved, that she did not want that long, long goodbye for her boy. Some of this, I think, is about being able to see the other person's need and to see what is best for them from their own point of view, not just our wish to keep our loved ones with us till the very last minute, which I also appreciate. But at some point, I think one has to not just be the child, but also the adult, and not just be the spouse, but also the friend.
And as Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird said, you can never really understand a person's perspective until you've stepped into their shoes.
Right. And we won't get to step into this. If you have a partner or a parent with dementia, you are not going to get to step in their shoes. You are not going to have that experience of having driven someplace and now find yourself someplace where you don't know how to leave, or you don't know what to do with the grocery cart, or that this person knows you and you know them, but you do not know what the connection is. Like, we don't have that experience, and it is different for everybody. But those shoes you don't really get to stand in.
What has kept the window open for you throughout this process?
There's a great little description by Diane Ackerman, and she was such a wonderful poet and also writer about nature. And she's describing a dead tree that's fallen over in the forest, and it's over. It's a log. It's not a tree anymore. And she says, but as the season passes, the log fills up with moss and grass and flowers. And it's not a dead tree anymore. It is the ground for the grass and the moss and the flowers and the bees. And I think that's a lot of how I felt, which was, I was sort of stunned with grief, during the process and afterwards. But also, so it turns out, for me at least, You don't have to stop anything in order to grieve. You can just bring it with you. You don't have to retire and take to your bed. Nothing wrong with taking to your bed. I really wanted to do that. It just wasn't available to me because very shortly after Brian's death, we get COVID. The whole world gets COVID. And within weeks, my youngest daughter and her wife and their baby call me and go, "We got to work full time. There's no daycare, there's no babysitter, there's no nothing." And I said, "Well, come on up." And so we lived together for about the next 6 months. And that was a gift. And so everybody handles their grief differently. Everybody does what they need to do. But for me, to be thrust in the middle of life, it was how I went from being like a dead tree to a home for all the plants in the garden.
So you once said about writing, you build your road as you go.
Yeah.
And how is your road unfolding for you now?
Oh, now, pretty great. I feel like what I really learned after Brian's passing, I think, was that the the appreciating the sunset, the watching the clouds, the smelling the rose, the spending 5 extra minutes with the kids so they don't have to rush out the door is not optional. It turns out that that's essential. The other things are optional. But that stuff is essential to being a whole human being. And that was a great gift. So the road, the road is still bumpy, but it also, takes you through all this beauty.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for this time this afternoon. It's been just a delight to learn from you.
Thank you for joining us for this special Valentine's Day episode of Voices of the Completed Life. And thank you to Zoe Wilshire, the editor of the Completed Life podcast. If you are interested in watching this interview, please go to our website and click on the Programs tab. Scroll down to the 4th Annual Fall Conference. There you will find the video of this interview with Amy Bloom, our keynote speaker. You will also be able to hear other episodes of our podcast series by going to the Program tab and clicking on Podcasts. We would love to hear from you. Please send us your reflections, comments, and ideas of gifts or your stories of the completed life by emailing us at info@completedlife.org.